Okay. Oh, hey.
Ashley,
Hi,
nice
Dan.
to meet you. I'm just going to flash by at 10 minutes and 5 minutes to let you
Okay.
know. If we're done.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, so my name is Dan. I'm going to start the next session. So my talk is about Asia, actually, Asia Pacific. And I think the one thing I'm going to try and hopefully everybody will take away from my particular talk will be why you need an Asian strategy. I'm not exactly sure, you know, if everybody's if you're startups or if you're investors or if you're just interested researchers, but hopefully that'll be your takeaway. So I'm going to be taking a very different approach or viewpoint from other people. So I'm probably about as industrialist as you get, but basically a born-again investor, more on the impact side. For the past 15 years, I've been investing in private equity style deals. So we've been investing into traditional food and beverage companies. We led a buyout of a $200 million duck producer. It's one of the largest duck producers in the world outside of China, actually. That was back in 2012. 2 years ago, we acquired a leading food manufacturer based out of Thailand. And that's actually how this particular journey started with me and our foray, and now it's somewhat of a mission for me and our company and our family office into the plant-based sector. And so a really short background of myself. So we have a family office based out of Thailand. We also run a private equity fund for the Thai government, and I have a multifamily office with one of the largest food conglomerates in South Asia called, it's a family member of this group called CP. And we just, it's a pretty odd eclectic group of deals that we've done, but we just bought the second largest consumer finance company in Thailand. So basically how I got started on this journey, just to provide some context, was, so we acquired this food co-packer, which is NR, and we're a sponsor of this event, and it's primarily producing sauces, condiments, and ready-to-eat meals. And when we looked at our fastest growing customer base, and it happened to be plant-based foods, and we did a deep dive, and I love the sector. I met the people, I met the venture capitalists, I met entrepreneurs in this sector, and I fell in love. And when you're looking at it from an investment perspective, and you're looking, if I can deploy capital and I want to get 5 times on my money, do I want to be in a business that potentially is slaughtering animals, or do I want to be in a feel-good business and I'm meeting a lot of great people that are somewhat mission-minded? It's a pretty obvious choice. And coming from the private equity world, you don't really see this, I mean, you're in a world of sharks, right? And it's a very big ocean with a lot of opportunity, and it's capitalism at its finest. So getting to my topic, why everybody should have an Asian strategy? Number one is impact, okay? And I'm gonna start rambling a few statistics I found. So by 2050, and this is a very different statistic, okay? There's going to be 3 billion new people who will join the middle class, okay? And I'm going to frame that as why this is very important. Because the majority of this new middle class will be entirely in emerging markets, and most of the 90% of that will be actually in Asia Pacific, okay? By 2030, that will be 1.3 billion. And why this is important is this. The middle class in Asia Pacific spends between 6 to 8% of their income on animal meat. Whereas upper income, which isn't that significantly different from an Asia Pacific perspective, spends only 2%, which means even though you're graduating from lower to middle and then middle to higher, doesn't mean that you're consuming more meat. I was asked a question to answer, and I'll address this now, is whether meat is considered a luxury, and it is and it isn't. It's just part of life, and it would only be considered luxury if you're eating Wagyu meat or something, or like an A5 steak in Japan. And this is pretty interesting. So pork and chicken represents 2/3 of the $200 billion processed meat market. Now, if you look at where corporate investment, M&A activity is resonating, a lot of it is coming from Asia. It's Chinese capital, it's Thai capital, Thailand from where I am, all investing, acquiring companies in the Americas, in Europe. And with this capital, we are then dictating exactly where manufacturing strategy is going forward over the next decade or so. So I'm going to also put this a little bit into a more relevant context in terms of animal welfare. So 50%, okay, of the amount of pork produced, 25% of the amount of the world's poultry, and 10% of the amount of beef is actually produced in China. Okay, now that doesn't include what China imports, okay, and this does not include domestic production in other countries such as Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, India, etc., in which we're also very large re-exporters of protein, especially seafood. Thailand, we're one of the biggest seafood exporters. Now, it's really simple to think, and I'm a co-investor with some of the world's largest protein companies, for example, like Cargill, CP, and when you look at it, it's easy to put a target on the big companies. It is very, very easy, right? And I will say that that's the wrong target, okay? Because of all these big companies with multi-billion-dollar market caps, multi-billion-dollar balance sheets, they are probably the most focused on ensuring that their products are compliant for supermarkets in the Western world and sustainable because they are forced to be sustainable, unfortunately. But now it's some of the good things is a lot of these big companies have now made it part of their mission. What we should be looking at is animal husbandry processing for local, for like the local small farmers, the local small processors in Asia Pacific, because this is where animal welfare is most often ignored. Okay, when you think about, for example, I used to own, and thank God I'm completely exited, so I'm no longer involved with this industry anymore, a duck processor. And as part of that, you ensure that before you do the processing, that the duck is completely unconscious, so for compliance purposes. But if you look at it, right, duck is a major protein source for a lot of countries in Asia Pacific. And a lot of this is coming from like these small farms who send it to slaughterhouses. And there is, I can pretty much, from what I've seen, they have no concern with regard to animal welfare. And so this is why I think in terms of the plant-based revolution is that, the target is, of course, you want to pressure big corporates, but you also want to look at domestic production, domestic animal husbandry. That is the first reason why I think you should have an Asia-Pacific strategy, which is impact. You'll get your biggest bang of the buck, and you'll save the most animals if you have the Asia-Pacific strategy. The second will be its low-hanging fruit. So by religion, a lot of Asia-Pacific is actually vegetarian or vegan. I can tell you, I was born in the US. Okay, so I was born on, I ate McDonald's for most of my childhood life. I moved back to Thailand when I was 16, and then I lived off KFC for 2 years. And it was so bad to the point where my mother, who's Buddhist, she asked me to start following some of our religious, edicts. And so I became vegan once a week. And for the longest time, and this is where the low-hanging fruit becomes, I dreaded it because the quality and the type of food that we had available was just absolutely horrible. And it's basically it's vegetarian products from that was initially adopted from Taiwan. So if you look at Asia Pacific, okay, in terms of consumer preferences, right? So you've got the North Asian countries, which is primarily Buddhist and Taoism, and then and that influence basically all the way down to South Asia. And then, so you've got like these, it's more of like a vegan, as in the type of vegan that we think of, type of focus. And then you've got, for example, on the South Asian, which would primarily be India, where you've got 40 to 50% of the population which are vegetarian, not necessarily vegan. And so getting back to basically the type of products we have available. So in Thailand, for example, it's called protein kaset. And the literal translation means protein from agriculture, and it's basically extruded soybean product. And it's absolutely horrible. And so you have generations of people who eat this out of just religious ritual, and they're forced to eat it, and then you eat it just on that particular day, or we have, there's a vegetarian festival. So basically, for example, in Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, you basically go 10 days being vegetarian, not vegetarian, vegan, okay? And it's an ideal place where you can introduce great tasting plant-based foods to a population which does not want to be vegan, but you're forced to be vegan during that time period. And so if you can convince them during this period where they have to eat your product, then you've got a pretty good opportunity, right? You've got an enclosed market. And they're willing to spend, and vegetarian, vegan products during that period is 3 times what a normal product would cost anyways, and so they can afford it. Beyond Burger would definitely be affordable during that period, and so I think it's it's just low-hanging fruit, just by religion alone. And health. And so going back to my statistic on the difference between middle class and upper class, and so upper income, I'm sorry. And so if Mytel did a study, there's numerous studies that've been done in which migrating income classes from lower to middle to higher, as they migrate, they start looking more towards healthier foods, and by nature that would encompass alternative proteins as well. And so all across Asia Pacific, which will dwarf both in consumption and wealth the Western world in the next 30 years, you basically have a huge market. I mean, just a simply huge market. And interestingly enough, there's a website you can look at it, the most vegan or vegetarian friendly countries. You'll see that 4 out of the 5 top countries are actually in Asia Pacific. Singapore, interestingly enough. But the opportunity is pretty scattered, so you have to take a country by country approach. So you can't take a cookie cutter approach. And so, for example, in Chinese predominant countries, the protein of preference would be pork, okay? And it has nothing to do with religion. It's just pork and chicken was just a very cheap source of protein, easy to grow, and that's how, just over the course of thousands of years, people had this particular preference. And then in India it would be, mutton and chicken, and that would also then influence down to South Asia. And so, if you want to enter Asia Pacific, you'd have to look at what we're eating, and then where we're actually buying the product, right? Which would be primarily wet markets, and then the second choice would then be supermarkets. And then, venue of choice, there's, obviously street food is a pretty big component of daily life. So I would say the third reason would be capital. And today I would call it curious capital. So there's a lot of funds now, a lot of startups raising money in Southeast Asia. I've got a lot of friends from big corporates from Hong Kong, Singapore, China, Thailand. We see a lot of deals come across, both from VCs who want to raise money as LPs, GPs, startups, etc. We are actually backing a plant-based food accelerator, which we hope to launch here in the United States. I would say there's a lot of wealth, and so half of the world's millionaires will actually be in Asia Pacific, and I think half of the world's billionaires are in Asia Pacific today. So there's a tremendous lot of wealth, and if you look at it, even the big companies, for example, I'll give you a very good example. So my partner, like CP Group, okay, so it's a $120 billion a year company. Their primary wealth is generated by poultry. They're one of the world's largest poultry companies, animal feed companies, pork producers. In China alone, they have one farm that cost them $1 billion to build. $1 billion, one farm. Can you imagine that? And when you look at what's happening here, and I was pretty shocked. So I've been trying to convince them to look at plant-based, okay? And they definitely see the trend coming. But in terms of committing the capital, it's not really there yet. And this is very true for a lot of other CEOs and executives as well. There are CEOs of a lot of top companies in Hong Kong as well, who are vegan by choice, but not necessarily willing to commit their capital yet. But they're curious and they're willing to look. And at the very least, right, if they're willing to take a look, I think with the right proposition, and now with Beyond Burger doing the IPO, I think they're going to start to see that there's validated exits in this space. And I think this is very, very important. And so I would strongly encourage, you know, depending on where you're from, who you represent, or what you're doing, to look at Asia Pacific, just from a capital perspective, but also from a manufacturing perspective. So in terms of food exports, I think a good portion of what you probably eat is actually from or produced in some way or some component from Asia Pacific. And just from a scale-up perspective, if you're a startup, raw material co-manufacturing, for example, like we're co-manufacturers, it's probably more advantageous to produce and manufacture in Asia Pacific, especially if you have an Asia Pacific go-to-market strategy. Yeah, so I think that basically brings me to the end of my talk. I'd be happy to field any questions if you have with regards to Asia Pacific. I'll try my best to answer them. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
Which markets do you see as having the greatest potential? Because it's interesting when you talk about India and China, but then maybe the income levels are so low, it's hard to put in a Beyond Burger or to put in a premium product. You need the combination of income to be able to get to those price points, as well as a kind of a propensity to plant-based foods. Do you have a view on which countries you think are at a tipping point? Because we tend to just go to Australia and New Zealand, but you're aware that there's many more opportunities. Maybe the hub, Singapore, Hong Kong, are good windows into there.
Yeah, sure. So I would look at it like this. So we just recently committed to invest into it's a high moisture extrusion facility in Europe. It's still confidential, so I can't explain much. But they basically, their plan is to manufacture meat analogs for the European market. They've been in business for 20 years. They have a great tasting product. I mean, it's just like a traditional sausage. And today I'm by choice, I'm vegetarian, and I'm almost practically vegan at this point. So to answer your question is this, it's basically the price disparity between plant-based foods and animal meat. So animal meat, unfortunately, is very cheap for the reasons that I've already discussed. And I think the goal of any startup should be how do you get that to be on price parity, right? Because if you can do it, then you'll be able to go to mass, right? And so, unfortunately, if we had a screen, I would show you a picture, which is basically the parity, this parity in the different countries, right? And only in the United Kingdom do you almost have plant protein and animal protein at price parity. And because of that, I think some newspaper came out and said that the UK has one of the fastest or largest growing vegan markets, right? So if you can do that, then I think most of Asia Pacific would be open specifically for the middle class and up. And as I just mentioned, the middle class is huge. And then over the next 10 years, 1.3 billion people are going to be coming. So I would say for now, like Beyond Burger, Impossible Meats through Green Common in Hong Kong, now they're in Singapore. They're starting to tap that markets. I think over the next 10 years, I think you could hit the key capitals. So Singapore, Hong Kong. I can't say too much about Japan, unfortunately, but I think there's already interest in Japan, in Seoul, definitely in Thailand as well. There's already interest, and they're willing to spend. So it's actually more expensive to eat at vegetarian restaurants in Bangkok or in Phuket, actually, and they're full already. So I would just hit the key capitals first, like what these other startups are doing, and then as a broader strategy towards engaging with the middle class, if you can get your price points down. Yeah. Yes.
In terms of price parity, do you think that the biggest challenge is scalability, or is there still a lot of innovation to be made?
Okay, so I think there's a few points. So I think one part is scalability. So depending on the startup, if you have, okay, I'm not going to name names, but so I've met one startup and their raw material revolved around a particular plant that took 8 years to grow. And you could only naturally harvest it, right? at this point. And so because of compliance requirements by supermarkets, it makes it extremely difficult for that particular startup to scale and to get their price points down. So I think number one, obviously, it definitely is scalability from a raw material perspective, and then depending on your manufacturing requirements, that's definitely there. I think the second point would then be working with supermarkets to ensure that you're there and you're getting into the right sections with a favorable GP that with the supermarkets. Yeah. Yeah, so it would be Buddhism specific, especially Taoism, and that's predominant in Taiwan. I think it's like 1/3 of the Taiwan is this type, and then I think there's 60 million people like this in China. In Southeast Asia, it would be the Chinese community, which probably represents 1/4 of Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore. Yeah. So it's pretty nuts. If you come to Thailand during this vegan period, you literally, if you are a restaurant owner, you are unable to operate if you don't have a vegan offering, because just nobody will come visit your establishment. Yeah. Okay, great. If there's no further, yes.
So I'm just curious to know, which categories do you think in the vegan plant-based space has the most potential for Asia right now?
I'm sorry?
Which food categories?
Oh, which food category?
Dairy alternatives or plant-based meat?
So number one, definitely dairy alternatives. So this is a good question. Which categories do I think has the most promise? But I think it's probably to be generally true for almost most countries in the world. And I would say this is also true also for Africa as well, because we currently export to Africa and we're getting a lot of demand from Africa for alternative dairy. But definitely alternative dairies, from liquids to then yogurts, it's pretty huge, but it's already there. So you already have people doing coconut yogurts, obviously there's also tofu drinks, soy milk, etc., that are already there. But that's, I would say, the big big opportunities. But there's a lot of people there. And then I think the second would be meat analogs, like what Beyond's doing, and probably more looking towards, depending on the country, as I mentioned, the type of meat, but also sausage as well. So in Asia Pacific, sausages is pretty big. Actually, all sorts of Western food is still, it's a pretty big, but I would say meat analogs. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much.